Welcome to Big Questions, and congratulations for working out that we are in a different venue this week. We're so delighted to have you. If you're just coming in, grab a sandwich, find a seat, and yeah, feel free to keep munching as the event goes on. I'm just going to introduce Richard to you, who's going to be speaking for us today. So Richard, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what your sort of background is in?
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. I originally trained in medicine in London and then went into psychiatry for a good number of years. And then I went to work with the L'Abri Fellowship, which is a Christian study center and community down in Hampshire. And then I was asked to develop a counseling program, master's in counseling program, in a theological college in the United States. So we lived in the United States for 30 years, and 2 years ago we returned, and now we live down near Petersfield in Hampshire. Is that
wonderful
enough?
That's great. I'm actually just going to hand straight over to you so we can get started, but thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Okay. Well, one of the things that's always been of interest to me is the sort of interface of culture and Christianity and theology, medicine and psychology. And this book that I wrote on perfectionism sort of came out of that, out of also looking at my own family and my wife's family and seeing traits of perfectionism in them, some of which were helpful and some which were unhelpful. And you can see the subtitle of my book is The Pursuit of Excellence and the Perils of Perfectionism. So this is a speedy, somewhat light-hearted, but also painfully serious look at this topic. There was a study recently looking at millennials showing that perfectionism was increasing over time. And one of the comments was that young people are compelled to curate a perfect life. This was a study done on a cohort from 1989 to 2016. And what they commented on was the increase in the pressure of having the right image, the pressure to succeed, the pressure for peer acceptance, and especially all of this being funneled through social media. The pressure on you all of sort of sifting and sorting and ranking yourselves and each other a lot of the time. And one of the things that comes out is that sort of perfectionism is not healthy. It leads often to depression, anxiety, to cutting, to imposter syndrome, to anorexia, and sometimes to suicide. So this is the relationship between imposter syndrome and perfectionism is pretty close. Imposter syndrome is not actually a clinical disorder. It's something that some of us feel when you come to Cambridge and you feel, what am I doing here? Everyone else is so much more intelligent than me. How am I going to survive this? So it's this desire to be flawless. Perfectionism is the desire to be flawless in appearance and performance and character. And it raises the question of what do we expect of ourselves? You have the external pressures of the academic, the athletic, your family environment. You have the internal drives from yourself. Some of us are built in more perfectionist than others. And the question comes, is it healthy or is it unhealthy? So the imposter syndrome is this feeling of, I'm not as capable as others. I'll be exposed as flawed and a fraud. And you're making constant comparisons, dreading the day when someone finds out that you're not as bright as you hoped you might be. Now, perfectionism, we'll come back, we'll sort of touch on imposter syndrome as we go through, and this question of where do I belong as a person? But I want to look first at the way perfectionism comes at you from all directions. And it's especially powerful in the visual media, and that's why some of these slides may be better on these smaller ones, because they show up the color better. But the amount of times the word perfect is used in advertisements like these. And for women especially, this pressure to have the perfect body, for men too, to bodybuild and to look like this in order to attract the most beautiful women. And of course, if this doesn't work as you get older, then you can resort to cosmetic surgery. And it's interesting that Brazil, the beach culture, which is where that picture at the bottom right comes from, has the most cosmetic surgery anywhere in the world. The most concern about having the perfect body. By whose standards, though? And then, of course, in technology, we see the promise in the development of technology, the possibility and potential for having that beautiful Lexus, or creating the right genes in the body. So you have the promise of technology, which then leads on in the health world. And as a doctor, I see this particularly to this sort of feeling we should be able to conquer death and disease, and the promise of perfect health in all sorts of ways. And we have the hope of creating perfect babies. We're already in a culture where we're trying to eradicate deformity. We're trying to select genes. And with nanotechnology, all sorts of things are possible. And it sort of feels like the promise of technology makes us feel we can always be better. But the problem is with people, they're not always so easily improvable, especially at the level of character and personality and behavior. So we have this sort of ever-increasing higher quality in music and technology and our phones and computers. And yet we ourselves, as you look around the world today, are involved in wars and famines and all sorts of difficult things. So you have the promise of technology, you are the sort of people who are sucked into this commitment to hard work and discipline in terms of your study, and the pressure to excel is enormous. So it's and in the Olympic Games particularly, you've seen some of these athletes burning out with the pressure on them and their coaches being cruel to them, trying to get them to get the perfect 10. But of course, each 4 years, the perfect 10 gets a little more perfect, whatever that is. So the seductive sirens of perfectionism, you could say, in our culture, and having lived in America for the last 30 years, I see it even more powerfully there, are in the area particularly of appearance and performance. We could bring it down to the simple 4 B's of beauty, brawn, brains, and bucks. That's what you're persuaded to pursue in your life. And one writer about this says, there's no denying that when you count up material comforts, remarkable achievements, and other outward signs of success, perfectionism will seem to have served you well, especially in this day and age. We've been going through an era in which setting high standards and devoting an inordinate amount of time and energy to attaining them is considered a prerequisite for success. But appearances can be deceiving. Now, here we get into the more psychological analysis of perfectionism. There are 4. We often talk about the 4 types of appearance. Some people are perfectionists just in the way they look, or the way their house looks, or their car. Others, in terms of their performance, they have to get straight A's on everything. They have to be on all the first teams. Others are moral perfectionists, so that I had a student who told me his father never drives more than 29 miles an hour, so that he never goes over the 30-mile-an-hour limit. But that sort of pervaded his life in other areas too. And then some are all-round perfectionists. So we'll begin to see that sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. What is it that makes perfectionism an unhealthy thing? That's what we need to look at a bit more. One study that was done some years ago looked at 820 academically gifted sixth graders in the States and found 25% of them they called dysfunctional perfectionists. In other words, extreme, demanding a huge amount of themselves. 42% healthy, and then 33% non-perfectionists. Now, what is a non-perfectionist? They used the language of disorganized, unreliable, lacking in self-discipline. I think there are some very laid-back people who are just delightful to be with, who are fun to be with, you might call who are non-perfectionists. Others have put it in somewhat humorous form. If you can't learn to do something well, learn to enjoy doing it poorly. Or it takes a bit less time and most people won't notice the difference until it's too late. Some people live in that sort of world, but not the perfectionist. So the unhealthy perfectionists have high standards that are high beyond reach or reason. They strain compulsively and unremittingly towards impossible goals. They feel their best efforts are never good enough. They're unable to feel satisfaction or joy in a job well done. And this is the critical one. They measure their own worth entirely in terms of productivity and accomplishment. They're preoccupied with performance or appearance. Now contrast those with what we might call the normal healthy perfectionist, or we might call them people of excellence. They pursue excellence, but they derive a very real sense of pleasure from the labors of a painstaking effort to meet those high standards. They feel free to be less precise as the situation permits, and they rejoice in their skills. They appreciate a job well done. Now, perfectionists too can be, we might describe them as driving or defeated. Some are so perfectionist that you go into their room and it's just chaotic because they can never get it tidy enough. So they give up. And this relates to one of the classic features of perfectionism, which is all or nothing, black or white thinking. And we'll come back to that theme in a number of ways. Secondly, the need for control. The feeling of I've got to get everything absolutely in the right order, in the right place to feel safe and secure. The tyranny of the oughts and the shoulds. I ought to be doing, 6 courses, playing an instrument, being, on an athletic team. I ought to be doing all of these things. And having excessively rigid standards and being inflexible. Now, the thoughts and the feelings that under the surface with this sort of unhealthy perfectionism are the feeling of I'm never doing enough. I'm always failing. The feeling of shame and inferiority. We'll come back to shame too. But shame, in a sense, is I'm a bad person. Not just that I've done something bad, but I'm a bad person for not living up to my own or to other people's standards. It's a constant feeling because I'm never quite making it there. Something is wrong with me, I'm not enough. And that, of course, takes us back to the imposter syndrome. Then there's an excessive concern over mistakes, doubts about actions, over responsibility. All of these tend to go along with this unhealthy perfectionism. So there's always anxiety and worry that I haven't done enough, that I'm not going to be good enough. I'm not going to be perfect enough. There's procrastination and I've had a number of students trying to write papers for me who can never They never start because they can never get it good enough in their heads. So they leave it until the very last minute. And even then, they may not get it there. And then indecisiveness. I want to make the perfect decision, so I keep putting off my decision or looking at multiple options. And the list goes on. Now, remember, this is the unhealthy side of perfectionism, of excessive checking, list-making, organizing, not knowing when to quit, giving up too soon, decreased productivity and performance, unable to delegate. And then perfectionism is also associated with eating disorders. Now, obviously, this is more common for women, but there are a certain number of men who struggle with this. But when you're surrounded by these sorts of images in the advertising world, and if you've grown up in a household where you're longing to be accepted and loved in a lonely world, where you have been abused and you want to feel powerful in a dangerous world, or in control in a disordered world. One young man told me as he heard his parents shouting at each other in the next room, I decided to make this my room, my place of order. So he structured everything very neatly. All his pencils were in a row on his desk. His clothes were all color-coded in the cupboard, and so on. And of course, eating disorders can become very extreme. Perfection, a beautiful fairy tale that always leaves you hating yourself. And for men, there may also be a hatred of the body or an obsession with the body. So there's this sort of all or nothing attitude to the body. You neglect and abuse it, or you obsess about it to get it the way you want it to look. Now we could go on, and I don't want to spend long on these at all, but famous people who have got so depressed and then committed suicide. An example of this, just quickly here, was a doctor in the States, a superstar pediatric cardiac surgeon. His 830 surgeries over the course of just 18 months yielded an incredibly low 2% mortality rate. He was universally admired. He was called a medical miracle worker. He ran triathlons to stay fit for the operating room. He flew out of state to harvest hearts personally. He called ex-patients on Christmas Day to check on them. His surgical team was the focus of a 2002 TV documentary, and then it all came crashing down. In 2004, he died of an intentional overdose of oxycodone and alcohol. The hospital CEO said, "Some would say they saved 98 out of 100. He looked at it and said, I lost 2 out of 100. That's the unhealthy perfectionist attitude. But you can see for a lot of his life, he had been incredibly successful. It had been a very good thing in some ways for him. But it may lead on then to relationship problems, scrupulosity, obsessive-compulsive symptoms. And when you look at the roots of perfectionism, some people temperamentally, genetically are that way. For many people, it's part of the culture, the subculture. I'm sure it's this part of the subculture here in Cambridge. It's partly in the military and medical world, the social media. But a lot of it comes too from one's family, whether it's the modeling, the example of your family, or being shamed. You know, one young man told me that he didn't get the lawn that he was supposed to be mowing at home to look like Wimbledon, and his father had a tirade, a tantrum with him. People who notice the one B in a whole series of A's, who notice that you haven't made the bed perfectly. That is the sort of shaming environment where love is exchanged for perfection or seeming perfection. So, and you see this in the pressure from your peers. This was one college in the States that this person wrote about, the triple bind: to be sweet, pretty, and nice, to be athletic, competitive, and get straight A's, be impossibly perfect without effort. And there were a large numbers of suicides on that campus, and it was related to the pressure of perfectionism. So we can see that this underlying this often are excesses of shame, of fear, of sometimes of pride, of wanting just to be the best. So these are all the sort of psychological explanations, but there are some bigger questions underneath this that I think that we have to consider just briefly. And one of them is the question about the nature of reality. You know, what story do you live by? Is it the story of what Cambridge University dictates to you in terms of who you have got to be and what is important in life? Is it the story of evolution, chance, and time? What is perfection in that story? Is it the story of an impersonal God or energy where maybe you're perfect already if you could meditate to that place enough? Or is it the story of a personal God who has created us perfect, and from that perfection we have fallen, and we are being restored in a relationship with that personal God? And that leaves us, if that is true, with a memory of perfection and a longing for it, which I think most of us somewhere in our being do have, a memory and a longing. And it brings us to the question of what beliefs do you have about values? How important is appearance? In your culture, how important is that? How important is performance? Is productivity? And we not only look at our English culture, but maybe we look at an Asian culture or an Eastern European culture. And in each place, those values will be somewhat different. Some will have higher perfectionist aims, some will have lower. But if we go to and as a Christian, I believe that that we live in this story where there is a personal God who has made us and is calling us into a relationship with Him. And if we look at Jesus' teachings, which are part of that personal story, He gives some clues to what values are important. You know, the home that you aspire to, Jesus says, be careful because moths can come and rust will come to your nice Lexus and thieves will break in and steal. So these things at an ultimate level are threatened. They're not ultimately hugely important. They have some value, but they're not necessarily the goal of life. And anyway, in the end, the Bible says and it's obvious to us all around, our bodies fade. The beauty of an actress fades. And many of us will end up like this poor lady in that bottom right-hand corner there. With dementia maybe, with a body that is shriveled and shrunken and unable to do all the things that she used to aspire to. So appearance, possessions, performance, whether it's in your grades, your quality work, your athletic or artistic performance, financial success, and so on. But there's another part of us as human beings which is about character and relationships. And those, Jesus says, and the Bible says, are ultimately the most important beyond the other things. The other things they're not unimportant, but they shouldn't have, as it were, the top priority. So what is really important from a Christian perspective is that we become good stewards of the gifts our Creator has given. That we develop character and moral integrity, that we learn to love other people well, that we become truly human, what we were intended to be by living in a relationship with our Creator. So all the great religions of the world have this common awareness of being imperfect. So most of them just say, try harder. In fact, all of them say, try harder. Develop certain disciplines, certain meditative techniques. But Christianity says we live in a physical and moral, a personal and moral universe where we cannot achieve perfection on our own, that we need help. And God has sent us a rescue in Jesus Christ, a loving God who comes to rescue us, to accept us as we are, to gradually transform us. And this is what the word grace is all about. It's a gift given to us when we don't deserve it. And that's what Christianity says, that in Christ we are given that gift. So if this is true, our fundamental worth and identity don't depend on our appearance and performance. When we know we're accepted and loved with all our imperfections, we're set free to pursue excellence without fear of failure or rejection, and with gratitude to our Creator. So a number of clients in counseling that I've dealt with who are struggling with the unhealthy form of perfection talk about themselves as recovering perfectionists. They've begun to let go of being in control. They're not so afraid now of failure and rejection. They're not so concerned about what they do and how they look. All of those things are gradually reducing in intensity and frequency. So going back to this question, can I ever do enough to belong? I think it's about, from the Christian perspective, it's about having a relationship with God, a relationship with people, and a relationship with oneself. That is where you're able to accept yourself, to know you are loved and accepted by God, and to learn to love other people well. So it's experiencing acceptance and grace with the worst hanging out. And I finish here taking you back to childhood. If you remember the story of the Velveteen Rabbit, the well-used toys were in the nursery. And what is real, asked the rabbit one day when he and the skin horse were lying side by side by the nursery fender. Does it mean having things that buzz inside you and a stick-out handle? Real isn't how you are made, said the skin horse. It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real. Does it hurt? Asked the rabbit. Sometimes, said the skin horse, for he was always truthful. But when you are real, you don't mind being hurt. Does it happen all at once, like being wound up, he asked, or bit by bit? It doesn't happen all at once. Said the skin horse, you become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't often happen to people who break easily, or who have sharp edges, or who have to be carefully kept, the perfectionists. Generally, by the time you're real, most of your hair has been loved off, your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and are very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you're real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. So the Christian hope, the Christian understanding is that God loves us and God is changing us in a relationship with Him to become more and more sort of godlike, not gods ourselves. So C.S. Lewis says that, and in the middle of this quote, because I'm not going to read it all, He will make the feeblest and filthiest of us into a god or goddess, a dazzling, radiant, immortal creature, pulsating all through with such energy and joy and wisdom as love as we cannot now imagine. A bright stainless mirror which reflects back to God perfectly his own boundless power and delight and goodness. So this is the Christian hope that we come back to. He is going to make us perfect. We cannot do it ourselves. Let me finish there, and I've gone through a lot of stuff very quickly, but I know your time is short and you need to move on.
Thank you so much, Richard. To give a round of applause.
Thank you.
Yeah, there was a lot we covered there, and some really big issues. So it'd be great to have some time to chat about that on your tables. Some questions, if you're not quite sure what to talk about. Maybe think about, where do you feel the pressures to be perfect or to succeed? And what do you make of that alternative story of Christianity, this idea of a gift or not striving, or that idea of grace? Do you have any questions about that? What do you make of the alternative story? So we've also got we'll have a bit of time for Q&A at the end, and we should have a link on the screen in a bit. So if you have any questions, you can pop it on the pigeonhole and follow the QR code, and then we'll come back. But now just some time to chat on your tables, ask any questions you got. Great. Wonderful. It's so good to hear you chatting on your tables. We have 3 questions. If you need to go, if you've got any lectures, then please don't feel you need to stay. You can head off at any point. But we've got a couple of questions here. The sort of top voted questions is, you talked about how we have a memory of some sort of perfection. What kind of perfection was that? When did we have it, and how did we lose it?
Yes, it is on. That's a great question. I think that in the sort of there's an anticipation in all of us that we should be somehow better than we are, that we can go on working towards something better and being better. From a Christian perspective, the memory built into us of perfection is in the Christian story of God creating the first human beings as perfect beings, who then fell by their rejection of God and their disobedience towards God. And then all sorts of consequences came out of that in terms of disease and death and wars and family struggles and all sorts of things. So it led to imperfection. But then the Christian story goes on that we can be rescued from that and one day be restored to new beings, a new perfection. Quite what it will be, we don't know for sure. So in that sense, I think within the Christian story there is something very deep in us that in our, I don't know, to use Jung's term, the collective unconscious, the subconscious of the human race, that has a memory of something back there that we were perfect once. I think that's much more difficult within the evolutionary paradigm and story, where we came out of the apes and from a much more primitive world, and in that there isn't a memory of perfection of any sort.
Fantastic, thank you. The other question we got at the top is, how do we stop being a bad type of perfectionist? Which is probably more than you can answer.
That's the big $1,000 question. Yes. How do we? Well, I think it's pushing back against it in all sorts of ways. And the first bit is recognizing that what you live with in your perfectionism is being able to recognize the unhealthy bits of it. Because most perfectionists, even though they're unhealthy, don't think they are, and they think everyone else should live up to their standards. There's nothing wrong with them. So to be able to realize that pursuing perfection in this way produces a huge amount of anxiety, sometimes depression, sometimes obsessing for hours over a decision or a correct answer or writing a paper. So being able to see the bad things that come out of it, and then to be able to learn, and this is what we do in psychotherapy, is help people to look at their thinking patterns and then to begin to say, yep, there was one lady that I used to meet quite often, and when she would start talking, she had this way of talking about things in a very all or nothing terms, black and white terms. And I often used to say to her, Mary, can you hear what you're saying to yourself? And she would catch herself and she would laugh and say, oh, there I go again. My all or nothing thinking. And then learning not to need to be in control. But there are lots of psychological ways that we would share with anyone in the world, Christian or not. But at the deepest level, there is, I think, this understanding of what we call grace. That is, you don't have to live in fear all the time that you're not going to live up to, this impossible standard. Because God loves you just the way you are. And He is willing to accept you as you are. That's grace. And then your desire for excellence and to do well is motivated not by fear, but it's motivated by love for God and gratitude to Him for what He's done for you. And those two, fear and gratitude, are very different, and they're both very powerful motives. One in a good direction, one in a negative direction.
Great. If our identity is not in what we achieve, but in something about who we are, why does that identity have to come from God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another great question. Your identity can come from all sorts of things, can't it? Whether you're a musician or an athlete or a mathematician or a writer. There are all sorts of legitimate identities in this world that Christians say those are all important. It's just a question of where your deepest, it's a sort of the deepest level of who you are. And if I'm a musician and I'm a violinist and I have an accident and one of my fingers is severed and I can't play the violin again, where is my identity? Do I have a deeper belief in a God who loves me still, even though I can't play and perform and get all the adulation from the crowds? If my identity is in how much I own and the stock market crashes, what do? Well, there were lots of suicides in some of the stock market crashes of history because their identities were rooted in what they owned. So it's sort of, I think it's asking, where is your deepest sense of worth and value? It may be in how your family love you, which is not a bad thing, in how your friends love you. But if they stop doing that, or if something happens to them, where then do you go for your sense of worth?
Great, thanks. There's two questions here kind of about sort of our friend. Coming from a Christian perspective. One is, how can a Christian practically approach their relationship with God without also becoming a perfectionist in that? And kind of, I guess in a similar sense, can perfectionism make you a better kind of Christian or religious person?
Yeah, yes and no. And it's the two sides, again, of there is a healthy way of pursuing God, and there is an unhealthy way of pursuing God. There is an obsessive, some of the monks in the medieval times who obsessively confessed every day, and they would flagellate, beat themselves, and do all sorts of things to make their bodies suffer because they believed this brought them closer to God and that God would be pleased with it. That was an unhealthy, obsessive form of perfectionism. But, and this is where I think if you do things out of, this comes back to the motives. Do you do it out of fear that you'll be rejected? So you're always living anxious, on edge. I've got to do this, I should do that, I ought to do this, I should go to these meetings, I should go to church every Sunday, I should confess my sins more, should read the Bible, pray more. Because if I don't, God will punish me. He'll make my day go bad. That is not a good motive. But if you do it out of love and gratitude, studying the Bible, praying, joining with other Christians in worship, those are all, if you do it because you love God, that is a good motive. So it can go either way, I think.
Great. Well, we've hit 2:00, so just one last question that someone has asked. What difference does this, I guess this is referring to grace or this sort of alternative story that Christianity is offering, what difference does it make in your life? That's the question.
I think some of the answers to my questions have, in a sense, it's come through in that of what I believe about my own identity, that it's not in being a doctor, having taught at a theological college, having written books. That's not where my deepest sense of identity lies. So that's one thing, and just a deep sense of the grace of God, and thankful for that. And I hope to, in my parenting, in my marriage, in caring for my grandchildren, as I do a lot of at the moment, that some of that grace, that acceptance of them as they really are, and not demanding perfection of them, will come through into their lives, just as God's love comes through to me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Richard. I just wanted to flag a couple of books. All our books are free. They're on the back table by the sandwiches. One of them is Richard's own book. So if you want to do, this is a very brief talk on an absolutely massive topic. So if you want to do a deep dive into perfectionism and possibly a little bit sort of about what it means as from a Christian perspective as well, then we've got this book. I've also got one called 321, The Story of God, the World and You. And if this idea of like a memory of perfectionism, the idea of being imperfect, where did that come from? Where does Jesus fit in? If that's all very new, confusing, this book is a really accessible but also sort of credible account that just encapsulates the whole Christian story. Where does God come into it? Who am I? What are we doing here? All of those questions. So 321 is a great book. So they'll be on the back table. Again, thank you so much for coming. Stick around to chat. Richard will be here a little bit longer if you want to come and ask any questions to him. But thank you so much for coming, and see you next week.